Hello and welcome to the second lecture of week 5 of the Open University's MOOC on genocide. Today we continue our discussion on the events in Latin America during the 16th century, during which modern research estimated 40 to 50 million Native Americans were murdered or died of epidemics. This huge number requires some explanation, and together we will try to understand the leading causes for the death of such vast numbers in South America. In doing so, we may also find an answer or several answers to the question of whether a real genocide was committed here, or at least according to its classic definition, as we discussed at the beginning of this course a few weeks ago. I will note some key points we take into account and consider when trying to tackle this big question. The great Spanish conquerors, including Cortés, who conquered the Aztec Empire, and Pizarro, who eliminated the Inca Empire, divide these mighty empires among their soldiers. These shares are called encomiendas, a huge bequest that may include an area of thousands of square kilometers. Every soldier who participated in the occupation of these empires was well rewarded for this cruel conquest, and in these huge encomiendas, the new Spanish lords begin to enslave the local population, which was previously enslaved by the Aztecs or the Inca. But contrary to the situation in the past in the original Native American kingdoms, which maintained irrigation systems, for example, and had organized architectural and drainage systems in cities and developed agricultural systems, the Spanish conquerors, though aware of the importance of these things, act as if it doesn't really interest them. In fact, it seems the Spanish care only about how to earn as much money and as quickly as possible. One clear example that has distinct hints of cultural extinction, which we genocide researchers call ethnocide, can be seen in Pizarro's actions in the Inca kingdom. The Inca kingdom had a great tradition of sculpting and using precious metals to craft statues of idols, temple pillars, etc. Pizarro and his soldiers simply take all the artifacts, art pieces, and cultural and religious objects they find, those made of gold, and melt them in melting pots. They melt them into gold tablets and send them in boxes directly to Spain as a gift to the King of Spain to justify their activities. Of course, they keep a lot for themselves. There is no shred of respect or any desire to preserve the culture that existed previously in the occupied territory. So we should keep in mind that these are Christian occupiers who consider the local religion as an abominable pagan creed, which explains the lack of empathy. In the huge encomiendas in the occupied Latin American territories, the Native Americans are sent to forced labor in unthinkable conditions. The Spanish house the new slaves in camps that are actually like pounds. Of course, living conditions are very bad when it comes to nutrition, hygiene, and medical care. In addition, there are also waves of huge expulsions in which the Spanish conquerors run a native population of tens of millions of people and simply send off hundreds of thousands of them if necessary, or tens of thousands in other cases, from place to place, sometimes thousands of miles away from where they lived before, to supply the huge demand for labor in the vast territories of South America. Of course, the local population separated not only from the native territories, but also from their places of worship that are sacred to them, cemeteries, temples, etc., finds itself in a state of emotional and psychological disconnect in the new places they are transferred to. Another important point regarding the situation in Latin America in the 16th century is, of course, the well-known story of lethal epidemics. The Spanish conquerors brought with them a variety of bacteria and viruses they themselves aren't immune to, such as smallpox. Some other diseases are considered childhood diseases in Western civilization, which kids get and become naturally immune to once recovered. Diseases like chickenpox or rubella or measles or even simple influenza. These diseases are found unusually lethal for the native Latin Americans. This simply because America was isolated from the rest of the world for thousands of years and was not exposed to any bacteria or viruses naturally transmitted between humans. This field of epidemiological research in general is fascinating and diverse in itself. We obviously can't elaborate on this story too much. I only mention that we do not have any estimate to determine exactly how many people died in South America by being infected with European diseases they were not immune to. We don't have this figure and probably never will. I will only point out the fact that eyewitness reports from that period, including from church missionaries who wandered between the encomiendas and converted the local population to Christianity, as well as the Spanish conquistadors themselves and even officials of the crown that come to South America during the 16th century, we repeatedly see how the Spaniards are unhappy that the Native Americans, excuse the expression, are croaking in droves as a result of illness. This doesn't make them happy. This fact contradicts the notion or claim that this was some kind of genocidal attempt to commit genocide through the spread of disease. The Spaniards didn't know what bacteria was at the time. No one in the world had any idea how diseases are transmitted at the time. So one can say that unknowingly at least in terms of premeditation, the Spanish infect the Native Americans with diseases imported from Europe and end up losing cheap labor when the natives die in droves. And as I just mentioned, this doesn't make them happy. So let's remember this essential point. Another issue worth discussing is the administrative cruelty applied by the Spanish against the new subjects. In stark contrast to the instructions of the Spanish crown over many decades in the 16th century, the Spanish conquerors who ran the South American conquest of this territory treat the local population in a way that contradicts the instructions from the royal palace in Madrid. They impose all sorts of taxes on the local population, the most notable one being the tributo tax or poll tax, which is brutally imposed regardless of the amount of money held by the local population. They have the natives sign employment contracts that sometimes not only bind them, but also their children and grandchildren for several generations ahead, essentially enslaving the local population although they are formally considered employees on the payroll. The Spaniards also suppressed the local Native American culture, making it impossible for them to maintain the previous rituals, converting them to Christianity by force, although the Catholic Church, as I mentioned earlier, prohibits this very clearly starting 1493. The bottom line, the events in South America in the 16th century are quite different from the instructions given by the Vatican and the kings of Spain. I will conclude this short conversation by mentioning a very significant factor in the eyes of many scholars who studied what happened in Latin America in the 16th century. As human beings, there is a pretty clear connection between our psychological and biological state. It is difficult to quantify this context and come up with a clear mathematical definition. But every doctor, psychologist, or psychiatrist will tell you that depression undoubtedly affects a person's physical state. So speaking of epidemics infecting the Native Americans, it is very probable that the psychological crisis inflicted on the native population throughout South America for decades would have affected their immunity to disease infection. People who feel that the entire world they knew from before had disappeared and collapsed almost overnight, never to return, are also physiologically prone to get sick more easily. Not to mention that such people will lose their desire to live to a great extent. There are many descriptions by people of the church, who are usually the ones documenting these events since their hearts ache for them, wandering native villages and seeing parents slitting their own children's throats and asking them, why are you doing this? Why are you killing your children? The Native Americans tell them through interpreters or sometimes in direct conversations, after some missionaries learn the local languages, that they do not want the children to grow up into a world like the one they live in. This point is difficult to confirm empirically. It is difficult to determine how dramatic it is, but to a certain extent it surely cannot be ignored, and we cannot ignore the effect of the Spanish intention to shatter their entire cultural, administrative, governmental, and hierarchical world, as well as the religion of the local population in South America, without providing a worthy replacement other than the culture, religion, language, and regime of the occupier, which was totally foreign to what the natives were used to. That's it for today. In the next lecture this week, we'll host the author of the book we are reading in our genocide studies at the Open University, Dr. Eitan Ginsberg, who will speak briefly about his book and probably answer a few questions that I will address to him. I hope you'll find this interesting. So goodbye for now.